Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time, as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. Today I want to talk about and kind of rant about the PlayStation 3 era, the 7th generation of consoles, and how Sony really killed all of their momentum going into this generation. But to start off, I want to talk about what Sony did prior to the 7th generation of consoles, to kind of preface my rant that I'm going to be going on today. So in their first iteration, their first console, the PlayStation 1, they came out the gates really swinging. They did exceptionally well, selling well over 100 million units with a really stiff competition from like the Nintendo 64. You had Sega still making consoles at the time, and they really just dominated the console market on their very first outing. They had the CD technology, they had really great first-party titles, they were pushing graphical capabilities, they were doing everything right, and they had a superior controller as well. And so Nintendo and Sega really got on the back foot, and Sony capitalized going into the next generation as well with the PlayStation 2. It is still the best-selling console of all time with 155 to 157 million units sold, eclipsing anything else, home console especially, but even the Nintendo DS, which sold like hotcakes, just barely hasn't been able to eclipse that 155 million unit mark. So the PlayStation 2 still remains the best-selling console of all time. Sony had all of the cards going into the next generation. In fact, all of their competition combined, with Microsoft's Xbox, Nintendo's GameCube, and the Sega Dreamcast, their sales combined equated to about 55 million units sold. That means the PlayStation 2 sold over 100 million units more than their competition combined. That is an insane mark. 100 million units is unfathomable in today's market with how much competition there is. But Sony was really dominating going into this next generation. They had the entire gaming landscape at their fingertips, and they had everything to hold on to, and they decided instead to really squander what they had and kind of shot themselves in the foot going into the 7th generation. One of the biggest things that kind of solidified this early on was Microsoft's decision to launch their console early. They launched theirs in November 2005. The Xbox 360 came out. It was the first console with HD graphics. It was really innovative at the time. It had killer apps. The controller was so much better than the original Xbox controller. They just really had everything going for them. They had a whole year in advance. The Nintendo Wii came out in November of 2006, a year later, and the PlayStation 3 came out in December of 2006, being the last to enter the market. Now, Nintendo really carved out a niche for themselves. While they didn't have HD gaming, they had a new gimmick with the motion controls, and everyone wanted to buy a Nintendo Wii. It was sold out for years after launch, and the Xbox 360 was killing it because they had a whole year to be making great games and really establishing themselves in the market. They bet on HD DVD technology, which at the time was unproven compared to the Blu-ray. People were unsure which format was going to be the superior technology. Because they had an extra year on the market, Xbox was killing it. They were making all the right decisions. And Sony, you'd think with an extra year of time to prepare, would come out the gates really going hard. But instead they came out flailing and limping. The PlayStation 3 launched at a price point of $500 and $600. To put that in perspective, today's with inflation, that would be like buying a $740 to $880 console. No one in their right mind would purchase a console for that much money. Now, at the time, Blu-ray was a new technology. Like I said earlier, it was something that was being experimented with. Blu-ray players were really expensive. They were in the $300, $400 range. So getting a PlayStation 3 was not much more expensive if you were going to be investing in the Blu-ray technology anyway. But since it was so new and people weren't sure if it was even going to stick around, people weren't ready to invest in PlayStation 3. They just didn't want it. To put on top of all of that, PlayStation 3 was such a complicated piece of technology that it was more difficult for some developers to develop games for it than it was to develop on the Xbox 360, leading to more exclusives on the 360 platform and games that were cross-platform to be much better on the 360 of an experience than on the PlayStation 3, despite the PlayStation 3 having much better hardware overall. They could store more data on the discs, leading to higher resolutions and better graphics overall. But man, the experience on the Xbox 360, especially for games in the Unreal Engine, was just far superior. You had slowdowns and frame rate issues that just persisted on the PlayStation 3 throughout most of its life cycle. It took developers a long time to figure out how to develop games for the PlayStation 3, which took more time and money. So people were more apt to put stuff on the 360. If you also look at the Xbox 360 Arcade with the launch of indie titles and being extremely successful over there, the PlayStation 3 started off the generation on the back foot, launching a year later, and then came out limping so badly that they squandered all momentum that they possibly could have had coming from the previous generation. It took them so much time to recover from this. I think the biggest thing that solidified their position was at E3 in 2006 when they were showcasing the graphical capabilities of the PlayStation 3. The presenter was talking about this historically accurate game with these Japanese soldiers. They were showcasing how realistic everything looked, and then the infamous giant crab happened. The presenter so nonchalantly says, "Here's a giant enemy crab," and just with no deviation, just talking about how realistic and historically accurate this was, and then without even acknowledging how ridiculous it is that this giant enemy crab that I guess was part of this historical battle just pops in as part of their E3 presentation. It was so baffling. All their decisions were just so stupid coming out the gate. Not only that, their newest controller as well, the 6-axis, kind of ditched some of the DualShock technology. The beginning, they implemented it later on, but it was not a very good controller. It wasn't ergonomically nice. Most people did not like holding the PlayStation 3 controller. They didn't like how it felt in your hands. It felt weirdly light. The 360 controller was fantastic. It's still like royalty to this day. Most people see it as one of the best gaming controllers of all time. You can see its design still being implemented into Xbox controllers today because of how fantastic it is. The PlayStation 3 controller, at least starting off, was not good. And even by the end of the console lifecycle, it wasn't nearly as good as the 360's controller. They just made baffling decision after baffling decision to really shoot themselves so badly and squander their momentum and really killed the PlayStation 3 if they hadn't made some decisions and deviations to kind of correct themselves and get back on the right track. It's amazing that they did, in fact. I'm surprised that this didn't lose them the generation entirely. The 360 ultimately didn't quite sell as many units as the PlayStation 3. Remarkably. I don't know how the PlayStation was able to claw their way back, but they outsold the 360 by a couple million units. But the first several years were awful for the console. One of the biggest pluses the original PlayStation 3 had was its backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 1. But because the PlayStation 2 is a more complicated piece of hardware and harder to emulate, putting that on the PlayStation 3 essentially meant you had to build a PlayStation 2 into the PlayStation 3, which made it a bigger form factor. So it was backwards compatible, but it was way more expensive to produce, making so that when they released their slim models, they were much smaller, they were much cheaper to produce, but they also did not have backward compatibility with the PlayStation 2 anymore. In fact, this was kind of the turning point for Sony losing backwards compatibility for their consoles. PlayStation 4 later down the line did not have backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 3 because of how complicated the tech was, how expensive it would be to implement into the PlayStation 4. Fortunately, they've semi-righted the ship with the PlayStation 5 being backwards compatible with PlayStation 4, but even then, we don't have backwards compatibility with the full library. Whereas Xbox has always been killing it in that department. If they didn't have backwards compatibility on their console at some point, they started implementing it down with software implements later on. They had those capabilities to make it so they could implement backwards compatibility, and that's become a huge feature. It's such a huge thing that now you can just buy most Xbox consoles and play their entire back catalog on any of them. If you get an Xbox 360 secondhand, you can probably play a lot of the original Xbox games on it. Sony's decision making just really has not led to that being possible. And the PlayStation 3 is just so frustrating. I didn't have as much problems because I adopted the generation about halfway through. I got a PlayStation 3 at that point. I played on my buddy's Xbox 360 a lot, so I had a lot of comparison. I enjoyed my time on both consoles. I didn't have as many problems because I adopted so late. But just looking back on it, it's crazy that Sony gave up such a favorable position and let Microsoft really walk all over them. Nintendo and ultimately won the generation with how many units they sold, but Microsoft was killing it in terms of competing with the hardcore audience. They really ran over them, and Sony just squandered their position in such a major way. It's just funny to look back and think, how delusional really were they? And this leads me to my next point, something else that really grinds my gears. They had the PlayStation Portable that was so successful, selling about as many units as the 3DS, in like the 78 million range. Pretty respectable, especially competing with Nintendo's DS at the time. They sold a lot of units, and part of that was because they had innovative technology. The UMD allowed for much better console quality level graphics, similar to like the PlayStation 2 on the go, which was nothing like Nintendo was doing. They had their great experiences, of course, but graphically they were awful. They were not good at all. So the PlayStation Vita was poised to be a really exceptional console, and it was in every respect. Had an OLED screen, it had great triggers, it had a back touchpad, which was innovative and new, and something that they were experimenting with as a new gimmick. They had PlayStation 3 level graphics that was unheard of at the time. Nothing that Nintendo was doing. The 3DS was barely emulating like Nintendo 64 games, and this was getting PS3 level graphic games with for a lot of first party support. Uncharted Golden Abyss was a landmark title for the console. It ran just as well as the Uncharted games on the PlayStation 3. And the idea of getting PlayStation 3 ports to the Vita was really tantalizing for a lot of people. The price point was pretty high at launch, which was a little bit of a turnoff, but it wasn't that much different than the 3DS at the time, especially for like the lowest model that you could get. So technology-wise, you were getting a much better product. And this, by all accounts, was the Nintendo Switch before the Nintendo Switch became a thing. It had incredible indie support. Like, it was really easy to make games for. People kept making games for the Vita all the way up until, like, really, really late into its life cycle, even after most people had abandoned it. It had all these great capabilities, fantastic first-party games, even some third-party support, like, with a lot of great developers making games for this console. It looked and played so well, and remote play became a thing for the PlayStation 3, so you had compatibility with your home console as well. It was, by all accounts, a slam dunk in so many ways. It maybe wasn't going to sell as well as the 3DS, but maybe it had the potential to sell more than it. I don't think it was going to reach the Nintendo DS levels, but I think if they had done a couple big changes, it could have had that potential. But instead, they made the worst decision possible and used proprietary memory technology that cost an arm and a leg to buy for your console. So not only were you investing in the most expensive handheld at the time, essentially you could buy a PlayStation 3 for the same price, you were also paying out the nose for memory cards that were so minuscule. A 4GB memory card was something like $20 or $30 at launch. You could spend all the way up to $100 on, I think, a 32GB memory card. Maybe it was a 64. Either way, for PlayStation 3 console graphic games, those take up a ton of space, and you're spending so much money on the console already. If you spend another $100 to get all the storage you need, you're spending $400 to $500 on a console just to play these games. Ultimately, this, I think, was the biggest nail in the coffin for the console. Most people weren't adopting it at day one. I got mine secondhand for a much cheaper price because no one was buying it. It was a baffling decision that they didn't just adopt SD cards, micro SD cards, like other places where even the 3DS did SD cards. But no, they had to do their own proprietary memory technology because Sony is weird sometimes and just does stupid things. They had such a great piece of tech. It was just like the PlayStation 3, except they did not come around with the Vita. Nothing they did changed the fact that it was going to sell abysmally. It sold somewhere between 10 and 15 million units. For a piece of technology that was so fantastic and so innovative, and again, with the advent of the PlayStation TV, you had a way of hooking up your Vita to the TV. This was the Switch. It had everything going for it. I played my Vita for so many years, had so many wonderful experiences on it, and taking such great console quality experiences on the go was huge. But they killed themselves before they could even get it going. It was absolutely stupid. And Nintendo absolutely capitalized on that with the Nintendo Switch. They kind of lost it with the Nintendo Wii U, but they came back full force and they took advantage of every misstep that the PlayStation Vita took and put out now is on pace to be the best-selling console of all time, even eclipsing the PlayStation 2. It's amazing what Nintendo was able to capitalize because of everything that Sony dropped here. I just get so frustrated at some of the decision making. Being someone that has had a lot of Sony consoles, and a lot of Nintendo consoles and some Xbox consoles, it's baffling to see this company that has all this money and all this technology and just squander it in so many phenomenal ways. It's amazing that they're able to right the ship with the PlayStation 3 and then get their momentum back with the PlayStation 4, because this, by all accounts, should have killed them in the water. They should have been out of the console business. Without the super hard work clawing themselves back, Sony would not be a player today. And if they had made better decisions, they could have really kept their momentum going and maybe pushed Microsoft out of the games business early on. I'm glad that didn't happen. I'm really happy that Microsoft is in the space because it promotes competition. They make good consoles. They have some great games, especially from that era of consoles, the 7th generation, and even some of the 8th generation. They had some fantastic games. Competition is super important, but Sony just had this really, really wonderful position that they threw away and have had to kind of pay for ever since. So I just wanted to rant about that and talk about the Sony's missteps, and especially about the Vita and how much it pisses me off, because I just wanted it to do better. And now we don't have PlayStation portable consoles anymore. And even, like, the PlayStation Portal, don't get it twisted, is an awful product. It's a remote play console with DualSense controllers on either side. It doesn't have its own games. It doesn't have storage. It's just a remote play thing. At $200, it is a huge ripoff. If it was $100, maybe if you needed a remote play alternative to your phone. But no, it's an awful product. And the fact that it even has the PSP initials, PlayStation Portal, is really an affront to the PlayStation Portable and how fantastic that console was. It makes me so angry that Sony jumped out of the console business because of their own volition, because they kind of destroyed it themselves, and now they're not interested in making them. I hope Microsoft comes out with their own portable console. I have heard some stirrings about that. I hope they do, and I hope it's super successful, and I hope it kicks Sony in the butt for ruining their position and destroying the Vita before it could even get going. So that's what I want to talk about today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.